film on Beatrice Wright, who has been my mentor since my years in graduate school and remains a good friend. She is actively engaged in and loving life at age 87. That in itself is worth watching and imitating. She also happens to be widely known and respected for her groundbreaking scholarship and unusual sensitivity regarding psychosocial issues of disability and rehabilitation. Her compassionate commitment, unwavering integrity, and warm personality combine to make her a preeminent advocate and guide for the rehabilitation professions, capturing her spirit as well as her contributions to the well-being and rights of all people, in particular those dealing with a disability. Beatrice, how you doing?
Oh, Henry, good to see you.
Thanks. We're going on an adventure.
Oh, I love adventure.
Be right back.
Now I'm at your disposal. I take offense at nothing.
Okay, great.
So whatever you want to do, do it. Whatever you want to ask me, ask me.
Great. So let's start by having you distill for us the essence of your first book, Physical Disability, A Psychological Approach, from 1960, which was translated into Dutch and to Polish, and I won't attempt to pronounce the titles in those languages, but just a tribute of its international impact.
It happened that Roger Barker was at Stanford University when I was in California at that time in 1944. I was there because my husband was in the Navy, it being World War II. And Roger was asked by the Social Science Research Council to do a review of the literature on disability and illness. And I'm handy, I'm around, so he asked me to join him on it. And in reviewing that literature, I can tell you, that was the best thing I did to prepare me for what eventually turned out to be a separate field in psychology. Because the prejudice and the discrimination in the research literature, because I actually went to the original, was so startling. You didn't have to have a PhD to recognize it. It just slapped you in the face. And I did, well, that review of the literature, the first edition of that book was, of this review of the literature with Roger, was published in 1946. And it's that book.
Adjustment to Physical Handicap and Illness, a survey of the social psychology of physique and disability, by Roger Barker, Beatrice Wright, and Molly Connick.
Yeah. Then there was a new edition in which later Lee Meyerson joined us as some kind of updating. So when we moved to Kansas from California after the war in 1951, I was not allowed to teach at the university because my husband was appointed as a professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry. But I could do other things. In the meantime, I had 3 children, and I was very glad to have my time flexible so I could rear them. I lacked the humility. I felt nobody could rear my kids better than myself. But in any case, so I got a grant, and that's what how this book emerged. It was not a review of the literature that had been done. So it was organized in terms of general problems that cut across disability and illness. So you had chapters like status position, the general status of discrimination. And you can imagine that then cuts across disability and any stigmatized difference. So there's no chapter called orthopedic disability. In the review of the literature, there is a chapter called orthopedic disability, blindness, deafness. No such chapters exist here. If you look at the table of contents and just read some of the chapter headings.
Inferior status position. So that refers to in society a stigmatized group is relegated to that inferior status
but
position.
Then what follows that?
Salutary status
okay,
position.
Right there, this shows you something.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of the chapter content, titles. You discover in reviewing the literature that people who are discriminated against also sometimes have an exalted position. They're looked up to. Somehow, if they have achieved greatly, then they are admired. So I always attempted to show a balance between the negative and the positive. Even in a chapter,
there's another one there called grievances and gratifications in everyday relationships, showing that you have your ups and downs.
Exactly. Now, that was honed because in the review of the literature, the prejudice was so great that it was all negative. Everything was negative. They didn't show any positive yearnings on the part of people with disabilities or achievements or adjustments. It was all compared to some hypothetical normal group, whatever that means, and the group of people with disabilities came out wanting. The most glaring example, I must share it, it had to do with stuttering. So this researcher took a group of college students who were stutterers and non-stutterers for comparison. And lo and behold, on some kind of personality test, it came out that the stutterers were higher in adjustment than the non-stutterers. Well, obviously, that couldn't be true, right? So what that researcher did is, well, he started controlling for possible factors. So he controlled for age. That didn't work. He he controlled maybe for gender. Now I'm not sure what the control. So finally, he got it that the comparison group turned out superior to the group of stutterers, and he stopped controlling. You know, the bias of the researcher comes in inevitably, and I'm sure I have my own biases, and that is why in the 1983 book called Physical Disability, a Psychosocial Approach, I elaborated 20 value-laden beliefs and principles. That's in this book. Because I became aware that how I treated issues and problems and evaluated research just had a different cast to it. That's all I can say. For what was in the literature, even to this day, though not as glaringly, but even to this day. So I wondered about that. What was it? And any time I got an idea, I wrote it down. And finally, in 1972, I wrote an article on value-laden beliefs and principles. There weren't 20 at that time. But then it got elaborated, yes, in this journal.
Rehab Psych.
And then it got elaborated here.
Mm-hmm. So it was originally written as sort of a reminder list to yourself about how mistakes could be made, or discrimination in a subtle form through choices or judgments or ways people interacted, including professionals with clients.
Well, yes, and the bias largely, I mean, there's so many largelys, there's so many reasons. When you attribute the person's behavior to the person, after all, we use the apostrophe, we say person's behavior. But we know it's axiomatic, if you think about it, that a person never functions in a vacuum. It's always in a situation, in an environment. So one of the value-laden beliefs and principles reminds us of the importance of the environment in which the person is functioning. And that behavior is always, but always, a function of the person interacting in an environment. And sometimes, once you get that idea, even though it's obvious once you get it, you begin to think, well, is this behavior, whatever you're dealing with, is it a property of the person? Or what has the environment got to do with it? Of course, some of the obvious examples would be access, issues of access. If a person doesn't venture forth, one can say, well, that person is not inventive, doesn't have enough initiative. But once you ask, well, what are the problems of venturing forth? If you happen to use a wheelchair, then you begin to at least include the environment.
And see how that contributes to the determination of the behavior.
Exactly. And even if you ask the question, does this person's behavior occur in all situations, or what situations does it occur in? Well, to take a non-physical disability example, let's say kids who are hyperactive. That's ADHD, you know, is a big thing now. As a behavioral disorder. So in the classroom, they're really, it is an issue, it is a problem. Because the child doesn't remain focused and is in and out of his seat and bothers other kids and etc. So we very easily attribute it to the child. We say the child is ADHD, hyperactive. The child is hyperactive. Is he hyperactive in all situations? You better examine a variety of situations. Is he hyperactive listening to music in a quiet situation? Is he hyperactive when he goes to the movies? A good movie that he selects? Can he sit through the movie and tell you, well, you know, you could go on. Well, that's why there is the 20 value-laden beliefs and principles, all elaborated in 2 to 3 paragraphs of what it signals in terms of for the researcher, for the clinician, application to real life problems.
Your approach, your whole work could be described as a positive psychology of disability. Positive psychology also happens to be a term that's currently in vogue because there is an emerging movement within the whole field of psychology to look at the positive elements of human behavior and et cetera, as reflected in this Handbook of Positive Psychology, edited by C.R. Snyder and Shane Lopez. I think it's 2001. And you have a chapter in this book, 2002. Tell us about your contribution to this anthology, the chapter you have in it.
Well, the chapter itself is quite a long chapter. Read the title. It's chapter 3.
Chapter 3. Widening the diagnostic focus, a case for including human strengths and environmental resources.
Notice the emphasis on assets, human strengths, and the environment, those 2 things. And what the article deals with is quite a bit of flawed human perception. That is to say, what about the way the human being interprets the world? In this case, disability. That leads the human being astray. Emphasis is put, for example, on what I call the fundamental negative bias, which simply states that if something stands out as negative for whatever reason, cultural bias, if you want innate, doesn't matter. If something stands out as negatives without a context of positives to contain it, the mind goes negative, and you have negative spread into the association process. So part of that chapter deals with all the research done on that problem, but also, naturally, what we can do about it, because we can make things better. Well, the first thing is to be sensitized to the fundamental negative bias. Something stands out as negative.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be aware that your mind is going berserk before you can choose to do something about it. Namely, stop the action of your mind. Say, wait a minute, hold on here. Then that's not enough. You have to substitute something else. And what you substitute is you look for the assets and strengths, what the person has going for him or her. The same thing really applies, stop the action, in terms of the environment. Because if you go into the environment, you're wise enough to have a look at the environment. And if it has to do with a negative, like ADHD as one example, or disability, or mental retardation, or some prejudice against an ethnic group, and you look at the environment, you'll find negatives in the environment because it spreads to the environment. So you have to stop the action right there and look at what in the environment is favorable so you can work with it.
Mm-hmm.
If you stop to think about it, these are so simple in conceptualization, because to affect any kind of change, you have to work with the assets in the person, what the person is going for him or her, and the resources in the environment, what you can do about the environment in order to bring about change. And that escapes both the researcher and the practitioner because of that fundamental negative bias. Probably, and now I'll stick my neck out, the fundamental negative bias is hardwired. Maybe in terms of evolutionary theory, that if something is negative, you better be extra vigilant.
Dangerous or whatever.
Dangerous or whatever. And that accounts for the research that shows that we give more weight to negatives than we do to positives anyway.
Mm-hmm.
We give more weight because we're more vigilant, because we need to ruminate and think about the negatives to protect ourselves. So the moral of that research, if you take it seriously and make use of it, is to do extra sleuthing and detective work in uncovering the assets and strengths of the person and the resources in the environment. And by environment, we mean essentially people in the environment. And those people in the environment include people with disabilities as resource people, support group, independent living groups, and so on. The ramifications just tumble forth, and yet you wonder why it's not always, but always heated.
Mm-hmm.
So that chapter's a long chapter because it deals with those issues. For instance, it deals even with the Bible of the classification system. The DMS is the diagnostic manual.
DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Mm-hmm.
For mental disorders. That's a big fat book. It's as fat as this book.
Mm-hmm. Full of pathology.
All pathology. With a few pages in the beginning about where, if there's any positive, they ought to have a comparable book. As fat, maybe even fatter, I bet you, on what the person has that allows them to go on, that needs to be built up.
Mm-hmm.
There's no balance in the DSMs. So even in this chapter, there's a whole thing about that. There's even a section for the statisticians on the trouble with our tests of statistical significance, because it only deals with differences that are statistically reliable. It doesn't deal with similarities. So it ignores all the similarities between groups,
Mm-hmm.
because
That's not what they're looking for.
what they're measuring differences, all the differences. So I go to take the statisticians on because I think that test of statistical significance has so distorted our understanding of human behavior because they don't treat of similarities.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point.
I go back to, I had polio in 1955.
Great.
And in 1971, actually before that, but it took us a while to get together. But we organized a group, got some people together that were concerned about the issues and concerns of people with disabilities. And so we formed the organization Madison Independent Met. Let's see, it was mobile. Madison Organization Behind Independent Living. Prior to that, we had a lot of emphasis on mental retardation because of President Kennedy and his sister having a mental retardation. And so the emphasis was on that prior to the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 71, when we organized for the goals that we wanted to hit, and they were advocacy, of course, and talking with the legislators, getting curb cuts put in, housing, transportation, and recreation, a lot of things we had on our agenda. So when all of these things started happening, more and more people were able to get out, were able to get housing, were able to get on the bus, the paratransit bus that we had. But we had to fight tooth and nail to get all of these things, to bring attention to them, to bring the awareness to them. And going back to my job, years ago they didn't hire people with disabilities because, as you said, they thought that the negative thought was, what can these people do? I mean, they can hardly move. What can they do? And so I was called in to take this job at the switchboard. And the gentleman there talked to me about everything except what was available and what was going to happen. And so then I said, well, I understand you need a switchboard operator, and that's why I'm here. Oh, no, I'm sorry, we don't have any openings. Okay. So then I went out in the hall and I was waiting for my ride, and the assistant personnel director came out. And she said, well, Faith, when do you start? And I said, I don't. And she said, what? And I said, well, he said there weren't any openings. She said, you wait right here. She went in there and I started the next Monday.
Good for you.
You know, I came through a time when people with disabilities really were advocates. I remember when in Washington, D.C., they were building a subway. I think spearheaded by this very activist Berkeley group of people with disabilities. They organized a group to chain themselves to the construction of that subway because the plans did not include access.
We did that here too.
You did it. Great. Now that's the kind of advocacy that I really do support. Peaceful, yes, if you're a nonviolent person,
Right,
which I
right.
think we are. But to be so assertive of our rights, even to chain yourself to the subway figure,
That's
It
what
seemed like.
That's what it took.
Yes.
It took that.
Mm-hmm.
And I see Mike really smiling because he's changed himself to more than a few things over the years. Including the what?
The White House.
White House.
White House.
Oh, great, did you know?
And buses?
Yes.
Did you ever chain yourself to a bus?
Yeah.
We didn't chain ourselves to the bus, but we laid ourselves out in front of it.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's,
Yeah.
so you remember.
Oh yeah.
Well, what about, in the climate of today, it seems to me there's more passivity. I'm not sure
Yeah.
I'm right.
The group after you in the 70s and early 80s were very active.
I think you're right. The group after you in the 70s and 80s
It was very
were very
active.
active.
Unfortunately, in recent
Unfortunately, in recent
history,
history,
we're finding it a struggle
we're finding it a struggle
to get the new generation
to get the new generation
involved
involved
and excited.
and excited
Because
Yeah, because they have access
because they have access
to everything
to everything
and don't get
and don't get
that we have to fight
that we have to fight
to keep what we have and to continue to improve.
we have to continue to fight to improve what we have.
And so we're really trying to figure out
And so we're really trying to figure out
how to get the new generation
how to get the new generation
excited
excited
about advocacy.
About advocacy.
About rights.
about rights.
So I think in the current political environment,
I think in the current political environment,
we're in a position
we are in a position
where we could lose a lot of what we've accomplished.
we could lose a lot of what we've accomplished.
That sounds like a bad thing.
That sounds like a bad thing,
And it is bad.
and it is bad.
But my hope is
But my hope is,
things get bad enough.
if things get bad enough,
This new generation
this new generation
will get it. Will get it.
will get it.
Because they're not getting it right now.
Because they're not getting it right now.
we can't lose the access, but we can lose the attitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still puzzled. I wonder why, even with the access, the physical access all over, as I said before, I live in Milwaukee, and they have curb cuts everywhere now too, and everything is pretty much accessible, at least public, and but yet, when I attend, let's say, go to a ball game at Miller Park, they have all these places available for wheelchairs and to come to games. There's very few, if any, people in wheelchairs who attend the ball games. Well, my point is they are still afraid. Too many people with disabilities and reluctant to get out there. They're still hiding in their homes, even with the physical access. And
I know a lot of that.
I think I think it's the psychosocial stigma that's keeping many people, even with the physical access, keeping them in their homes, and they're reluctant to get out there
It's also,
because of that.
there's also an economic aspect.
There's also an economic aspect.
So, I mean, majority of people with disabilities,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Mike.
the
The majority of people with disabilities
are still unemployed.
are still unemployed.
Right.
Living on fixed income.
They live on fixed income.
And the park does. Miller Park.
The what? I'm sorry.
Miller Park.
Miller Park
Does have great access.
does have great access,
But a lot of those seats
but a lot of those seats
are very expensive.
are very expensive
And people can't afford
and people can't afford them.
to, yeah.
Yeah. I've also heard about Miller Park and some other places that even though there are wheelchair spots available, at ball games people tend to stand up and cheer, and when they do, the wheelchair spot is in the back and you can't see.
Yeah.
Always in the back. Well, another aspect is the fact that that they glump access. So when the able-bodied people don't attend, you see maybe holes here and there, and you don't, people don't say, well, they didn't come, but because these seats that are designated for people with disabilities and nobody's there, it looks like, well, why'd we make a space for those people? They don't attend anyway. And it's so obvious. But as Mike said, that it's so apparent that the reason a lot of people cannot attend things is because of the cost. And they're not out there making those high earning jobs, so there's a lot of things to make a determination for that.
On the other hand, I'm well aware of the economic, that, people with disabilities are to have, are in the worst economic status of any, group, any ethnic group in this country. However, I've been involved in Milwaukee with people who have been given free tickets through, disability agencies and stuff to attend games, even provided with a bus, a pair, transit bus, everything to attend the games. They are still not loading up the buses, and sometimes the agencies have to eat the tickets because not enough people with disabilities want to attend the game.
Yes, well, as you can see, obviously I am a deaf person. There is one issue I want to talk about the most, and that relates to the issue of interpreters. Currently, there's a shortage of interpreters in the community because they are now transferring to work in video relay service, which means that the interpreting agencies aren't able to fill all the needs of deaf people in the community. For example, at my past job, I was seeking a promotion, and I had to rely on an interpreter, and because my boss feared there would be communication issues, I wasn't able to get that promotion, and he saw that as a very negative part of me working in that job environment. So just as people with disabilities have to learn how to advocate for themselves, we also need to learn how to teach people who are not disabled how to respect us, because they don't know our worth.
I think that ties in completely with Faith's statement about people being dependent, people with severe disabilities being dependent. You might be dependent on your personal attendant or the paratransit driver. Tom's dependent on the interpreter, and all of us tend to. I'm dependent on my therapist. I go to therapy regularly, and I would have a tougher time functioning in social situations like this if I wasn't able to work those issues through on a regular basis.
But we gotta remember, it's not always the disability that gets in the way.
But we have to remember, it's not always the disability that gets in the way.
It's society's attitudes and philosophy.
It's society's attitudes and philosophy.
And ours.
Yeah.
And ours, yes.
What do you mean by that in your attitudes too?
Well, I think that there are some people with disabilities that are just like anybody else. They're angry. They're angry with something. They're angry maybe because they became disabled. They're angry because somebody didn't do the therapy right. They're angry with themselves, And so they have to work. I mean, it isn't just the other person. It's we have to be willing to accept that other person as well. They may not like us for our personality, or oftentimes you can tell whether they're accepting of you as a person, or is it the disability, And we can tell that, I think, generally speaking. But I think that it's our attitude that makes a great deal of difference to other people.
But I think we also have the same kind of negative feelings that society as a whole has, and we have to learn that just because you're in a wheelchair, outside of being able to walk, you can pretty much do anything that you'd be able to do otherwise. That communication issues, that we can get around that if we listen carefully to each other. That someone who might have difficulty moderating their emotions, me, that we can learn to be more accepting of that range. And I think when we work a lot with people with disabilities, as we do here at the center, it's easier to do that. And part of our mission, I think, is to try to get that out into the broader world and let people know, what it's like, and we look beyond the disability, look at who we are as people.
I believe very firmly that although we have made a lot of progress, there's still a lot of stigma about what we can and what we cannot do, and we are not easily given an opportunity to contribute everything that we have. People are still focusing on what's your label and how do I interpret your label as fitting within my organization, particularly in employment as well as in housing. Shall I say something? I find that at the beginning of the 21st century, our beloved America is going more and more in the direction of individualism, sometimes called even independence. Each person for himself or herself. I worry about that because our society, our beloved United States, to survive, that's a strong word, has to grow more towards interdependence rather than individualism. As long as we remain stuck with the concept of each person for the self, that self-interest. You hear the word self-interest all the time in our international dealings, in our states' rights dealings with each other. As long as we are focused on self-interest, then people at the margin, people with certain limitations, intrinsic or cultural, will be kept on the margin until our society, it's a huge cultural, societal issue of growing toward interdependence. That's why on this mission statement here, the first part, read
The mission of Access to Independence is to join.
Now hold on. Access to independence. The word independence comes up there, but it's made the wrong way. Because it has to be access on interdependence. We are so interdependent. The rest of the statement is wonderful.
You have experienced some challenges yourself from advanced age and encroaching disability. Have you had any personal experiences that dramatically recalled one of your principles of adjustment to loss? Recalled it in either a reinforcing way that sort of proved the point, or in a way that made you sort of rethink part of your theory, now that you're living out
Sure.
that experience?
Well, I'll tell you the most recent one, which you partly experienced with me because I had eye surgeries.
Mhm.
So, and that was a serious business. As you know, I was supposed to be at the NIDER
Mhm.
seminar, and I had to give that up because of the eye surgery. It had to do with uncontrollable glaucoma. So with the eye surgeries, my vision decreased dramatically. And at one point, I wasn't sure whether it would go on decreasing so I would become blind. And that was frightening. And I began to think, gee, how will I manage? How will I manage? Because always I felt I could manage, sometimes with alone, sometimes with the help of others, but how could I manage? So I remember thinking that this is really just the initial stages of adjustment to loss. Now, I don't have to cope with blindness. It turned out that I had enough vision retained so I can manage. I do have an enlarging machine and magnifying glass that helps as far as reading
Mhm.
material. But I kept reminding myself, this is just the beginning. Adjustment to loss is a process. And I didn't go through this whole lecture, obviously. Just snippets of, one thought would generate the whole thing.
Mhm.
But so I now just remind us in words of what would be a flash otherwise, that after all, adjustment to loss is a process. And there are a lot of other losses. Of course, you don't have to be nearly as old as I am now, 87, to have experienced loss in one's life. You could be a child.
Mhm.
I have, from time to time, personal friends who are age is 50, 40, 60 passing on. And each time I feel, well, there's another anchor point in my life that now just has to remain in memory, but not in interacting. So that changes what Kurt Levine would call my space of free movement.
Mm-hmm.
It changes it. I'm careful to say it doesn't curtail it, because that means it shortens it, but it certainly changes it. And why not curtail it? Because new regions emerge as you deal with life,
Mm-hmm.
new experiences. So your total space of free movement may or may not be less, or it may be less. But that reminds me too of saying, so what if it's less? When is enough enough? When is enough enough?
Mm-hmm.
As long as you can enjoy anything in life, that's good. That's the asset valuation. Appreciate what you can appreciate. But for a time, yes, it was a big, scary issue. And it didn't come to pass that I had to actually cope with that situation.
Mm-hmm.
But I sure coped with it in my mind until things settled into place, and I can manage now. But loss of a loved one, of course, well, he died suddenly. I had no preparation. And I remember I was in shock. I tell you, Henry, I continued to teach and do my thing, but I don't know how I managed because I was in shock. I was numb
Mm-hmm.
from it. And what helped me in that situation of profound personal loss was that Eric was in the middle of writing a book. You may know about that.
Mm-hmm.
One of his areas of specialization was hypnotherapy. And I decided I would complete it. And so I tried to work with it and was very discouraged because I couldn't he had written separate chapters, but I couldn't get it into a integrated volume of some sort until one day I remember having actually an aha experience of, oh, I can do this by dividing it in 3 parts. And so that's how I reorganized everything and rewrote things and so on. And after 3 years, it was published in 1983, the end of 1983. It's called The Practice of Hypnotherapy.
That's a great shared experience
And
to
I
carry
remember
through this.
something, however, it was a great shared. I think that helped me over in continuing the process of loss, of acceptance of loss. But I can tell you, when I took the manuscript to the post office in Lawrence, Kansas, and gave it over to Guilford Publishers, who published it, I had such a letdown feeling. Oh, it was, and I apparently had hung on to that connection
Mm-hmm.
because I was always thinking of Eric. Would he like it this way or that way if I wrote it this way or that, and so on. And now that was over. And I had a very profound experience of being let down
Sounds like it was an empty feeling after you had been dealing with his ideas and his papers and his books, so there were all of these concrete ways of keeping his presence in your life.
In my life.
And then to package it up and to mail it off must have really been an emptying experience.
I think that it was very profound. I think empty feeling is appropriate and was necessary. But going back to my appointment as a faculty member and the years in between, again, it's an example, perhaps, when one door is blocked, it doesn't mean the end of the world. Take advantage of whatever opportunities there are.
A window opens.
Usually, and to remind ourselves time and again that something good can happen. Something good can come out of something bad. It may sound Pollyanna to think, well, something good will come of it. Instead of that, think other opportunities, other life experiences will come that can be good. They've galloped ahead so dramatically. Hopefully ahead meaning in a positive way, but the changes. And again, when I say with every negative there's a positive, in a sense, with every positive there's a negative. In a sense, you take antibiotics, positive, right? And yet the misuse of antibiotics means that microbes are becoming immune. So we have to watch out for the negative consequences of good things as well, and try to be sensitized to catch it in the bud before it gets too much out of you.
I think it's refreshing for all of us in the audience and around to hear your expression of having those experiences, those normal human experiences of going through, phases of the process of adjustment. Even though you're the queen of conceptual and clinical understanding of adjustment to loss, you still had those frightening moments, etc. I was wondering if you ever said to yourself, I should know better. I've dealt with this process and other people, clinically and conceptually for all these years. I should know better than to fall victim to, frightening thoughts or alarmist reactions or whatever.
I didn't have the feeling of I should know better, but I would say, use rather, give yourself time. Give yourself time. You see, there's one concept. You get satiated with brooding or worrying or whatever the state you're in acceptance of loss. You get satiated with that heavy feeling. And I believe that satiation effects, which is part of the human being, sometimes we say you get bored with something, you're satiated with it, you've had enough of it. That helps you take a breath and pick yourself up and dust yourself off and to go on. I've had that experience. Give yourself time. Give yourself time. And time always is on, I shouldn't say all, for most people in acceptance of loss, time is on their side.
Mm-hmm.
It helps if you have a support network and a society that's enabling rather than disabling.
Mm-hmm.
But time is on the patient's or the person's or the client's side. This card was a birthday card from my grandson, that firstborn grandson named Eric. When I received it, I thought, whom is he talking about? Not me. 85? Couldn't be. I used that as the introduction to my talk to point out the difference between the insider's perspective and the outsider perspective. Here I was viewing it from the outside with all the stereotypes of what 85 means. But knowing I'm 85 from the insider's perspective is surrounded by all innumerable contextual features that control that stereotype. So knowing inside that I'm 85 is not, wow, but seeing it as an outsider was, who could that be? That's minimizing assumptions and maximizing the whole person. And part of listening is minimize your own assumptions of which you're then imposing as a backdrop in highlighting and revamping what the figure of what the client is saying. So part of listening is just lay aside your own ideas, your own interpretations, your own assumptions. Have a more or less a blank mind and just open yourself to what the client is saying. And that formed a very important basis for my own clinical practice, because I always did some clinical work, but also theoretically in terms of emphasizing the difference in perspective between the insider and the outsider as a fundamental concept. And what that's all about, that insider perspective.
Hi, Beatrice.
Hi, Chuck. I interruptible?
Oh, just for a minute. I need to be somewhere at 12:30. How are you doing?
Oh, I am fine.
Good.
And this is the team that's doing the documentary.
Oh, wow.
That I told you that they would be coming and taking pictures.
Yes.
And they're going to do this after lunch.
Wonderful. Greetings, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Chuck Pasine.
Fong Chan.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Henry McCarthy. Pleased to meet
Henry.
you.
Nice
Thanks
to
for
meet
having
you.
us.
Hi. How do you do?
Hi.
This is Lon, Fong's wife.
Who's the photographer?
Sean.
Sean Jourdan.
Nice to meet you. Giving a great tour?
Yes, but I want to ask you a question.
Yes.
I'll explain the reason later, but because you're in a hurry now, I'll just get to the point. Remember our discussion about representative from and you said on July 20th you'd take it up?
Mm-hmm.
Did you?
Didn't have time on the agenda, but I've talked to board members about it.
And?
We're going to discuss it further.
Okay.
It wasn't a formal agenda item because we had other things, but I haven't forgotten about it.
That's good. And will it be a formal agenda item next time?
I can assure you that there will be.
Okay. Later, when you have more time, I'll explain
Okay.
a connection with this visit.
Okay.
Only because I had written something many years ago, and I'll bring that, which talks exactly about this recommendation,
Okay,
only in a different context.
okay,
That's
good.
why I say.
I'd like to read that.
Okay, I'll bring it. That's why I say you'll make history. I
Okay.
guarantee it.
We'll show them every nook and cranny here.
It's a lovely place, really,
Well, thanks.
and the
This is a great concept too.
yeah, the concept and the spirit and the community connection.
Oh,
It's
yes.
really a role model for the rest of such places.
Yeah, we think we have a special community, especially,
I think this should be
Downtown Madison.
nationally advertised. No, I mean it, in Life
Yeah.
magazine or some big thing.
yeah.
I really.
Well, thank you.
Well, you know how I feel.
Yeah.
Martha Jones isn't around.
No, she's at the meeting I'm supposed to be at.
See
I'm
you.
sorry, Beatrice.
I'll see you.
Otherwise, I'd have lunch with you.
Yeah, we're all going to the cafe.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you all.
Likewise.
The residents have a council where the life of this community, and the community, as I pointed out, consists of 4 different buildings or units. Is programming discussed and planned, and always with a view of enriching life and improving things. They elect, first of all, they nominate people to be on the board of this whole complex. Now, last time, I believe there were 6 nominations, and it was pointed out there was 1 self-nomination. And from those nominations, the governing board, which does not consist of residents, selects 1. So there was discussion from the floor, why can't we elect that person? Why should the board select it? It was pointed out that until the new administration came in, which is our CEO, they didn't have any representative of the residents, no representation. And now the board selects from the nominations 1. Well, some people are not happy with that, because why shouldn't we elect them? So I'm thinking about that. And I go to the CEO and I say, I have an idea that the board would have nothing to lose, but nothing to lose, and everything to gain if the residents would elect a representative. The board could choose a representative if they wanted to, so there would be 2 representatives, 1 elected and 1 chosen. There are 11 members on the board, so when it would come to voting, my goodness, there'd be non-resident members voting. They don't have to be afraid of the residents. What would the residents want that would be so far out that you could be afraid of any vote? And said I to the CEO, just think, the residents would be happier that they have somebody who they choose. The board, if they want, can choose another one, or just keep that one if they want to. And you'd have the best of all possible worlds. And so he then told me the history again, how there wasn't any representative at all, and how it took so much arguing and discussing on his part to get them to agree to have one that they chose from the nominations. And so I said, well, that's a good start, and now you can continue its natural evolution. Because it's a win-win situation. How often is there a win-win situation? He said, but no agencies in Madison have members on their board elected by their clients. And I said, oh, well then you'll be a first, and you'll make history. That was my allusion to his making history. And you'll set a model for all the other agencies. So I went back to him and I said, did you bring it up in front of the board? And he said, well, they're meeting on July 20th. Well, July 20th came and went, and I was busy with this, that, and the other thing, and didn't get around to contacting him. But today, since I thought it'd be nice to meet this remarkable man, Chuck Posehn, he is really wonderful. I thought it would be a good time to raise it. And he said, you heard what he said, that he raised it, it wasn't on the agenda, and then I said, well, will it be on the agenda for your next meeting? And he said, well, I'll make sure, or something to that effect. And also I said, I had written something that directly relates to this recommendation, and that was
What I just
number
read.
19,
yeah.
value-laden belief, which was written originally, I don't know if that particular version, but in 1972. So it's already 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take it from 88, so it's 15, 20 years
Mm-hmm.
old. So it's time. So now I mentioned that I had written something, and Chuck said, well, he'd like to read it. So what I'll do is I'll bring him this and have him read it out loud. So that's the story. You notice that one up there.
Yes, Strengthening the Self-Concept by Beatrice Wright, Professor of Psychology, University of Kansas, 4 p.m., Hancock Auditorium, Thursday, July 13th. But it's from Southern California.
Yeah.
University of Southern California.
Yeah. I taught there one summer and gave a lecture. And that was the title. And they had that poster up, and they gave me the poster to take home. I thought it was a nice decorative poster.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You knew Leo Biscaglia then.
Oh,
He was there.
I rented his place. And he was gone for the summer, and I rented his place. And it was a house high in the hills. And I was warned that you could hear the traffic underneath all day and all night. And that's why people didn't want to live there. Well, it was very easy for me to live there because all you had to think of that constant traffic noise as a waterfall. And as a waterfall, it's nature and lovely. Had no trouble. And I use that same trick, and I'll show you later in this apartment. When I open the door to the patio, the roar of the air conditioning mechanism from the health center is very loud. And people don't like to keep their door open because of the roar. Well, when it's not hot out, I keep the door open and just think of it as a nice waterfall. And it's very easy to live with it.
Mm-hmm. That's the coping framework in action.
Part of it, yeah. Well, you using symbolic meaning
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
to affect the affect.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So usually how many minutes do you do?
I do 30 minutes.
Wow.
And
So I couldn't go keep going. I'm just saying.
You run out of let's do that.
I do it at maximum load because I built up to it.
Yeah.
You know, I often think about our time together, how productive it was in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering about what you think about.
Boy, you know, when I first heard that you were going to be coming and teaching part of that seminar class on campus, I was just like, I just couldn't believe that someone of your stature in the field was going to be coming and, you know, I was just going to be sitting in the same class with you. So, I mean, I was really just delighted, actually.
So what did you get out of all this delight?
Well, the class, one thing, I remember you want everybody to write, like, it was kind of like a diary, if I recall, about our thoughts about disability and how that, you know, how disability played a part in the students' lives. And of course, for me, there were a couple other students in the class that had obvious disabilities besides myself. But I remember, I really surprised me. You know, I was, I don't know, I was in my 50s, and I thought I kind of worked through most of that whole, you know, how the psychological impact of what my disability had on my life. But I really hadn't, and it was really, I remember one of the things writing down was the whole area of, I think for me it was the acceptance of my disability. And I think that when I really got down to it, really did a lot of soul searching, but just how, you know, how really accepting I was of my own disability. I think what I surprised me, I came out with some real, I hate to use, but I can't think of a better word, almost some self-loathing, believe it or not.
Self what?
Loathing.
Oh yes,
Like hatred, you know?
Yeah.
Like, but then the more I thought about that, and then I kind of projected it to other people with disability. I think that's often an issue that a lot of people with disabilities are very reluctant to really go deeply into. Their own, you know, well, if only, you know, I didn't have a disability, I would have been able to do this and do that. For me, it was like, as a young person, I could have had more dates with women, blah, blah, blah.
Of course.
But it's different for each person, but I think it was, but it's difficult stuff, going that deep. But it was, it became like a release, and with that, I was able to really, yeah, you know. But and that was what kind of came out of when you had that seminar class. But then, as you know, I tried to make contact with you outside of class, and
That's right.
and I think I talked to you about my interests
Sure.
and disability harassment, and then we started our meetings off in that coffee shop.
Oh, right. Oh, yes.
Was it called Hilldale?
Yes.
I wasn't sure.
Sure, we did.
Yeah.
In the, what was it called?
It was a mall.
Yeah, in the mall, and
yeah.
a place to have some coffee.
Right.
Sure, we did.
And we just really, it was just real helpful. And I always went away more motivated, more determined to get through the whole, dissertation process, which
Which is pretty.
and oftentimes I thought it was never going to get off the ground, let alone get done. But I remember you always kept bringing me back to the importance of the situation or the environment. It just wasn't the person that was important, but it was both.
Well, I would modify that a little. The person is always important.
Okay.
It's the person in interaction with the environment.
Okay.
And there's,
Right.
to understand the person, you have to understand the setting,
Right.
the context, which in this case is the
Exactly.
environment. Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and that's why I continually kept trying to, somehow pull off where this whole phenomena of disability harassment, we could somehow have it in an environmental context to make it more.
And you are right. The
more
the harassment is the situational context.
Right.
But the person is the target
Right.
is still very important, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And we were talking about that.
Yes.
The role that the target can play,
Right.
other than being woebegone and helpless
Right.
and a victim.
And then, of course, we always really get into the whole role, the key role of the bystanders in any kind of harassment situation. Right.
And exactly.
And how key
Key.
they are.
Then there's another aspect too, which just before, while we were talking, we didn't go into.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the harasser. Now the harasser, one can call a bully, which we do,
Sure.
but that harasser has a problem.
Yes, you
I
do.
mean,
She
he
does.
needs help or she needs
Yeah,
help.
sure. Right.
Now, we haven't gone into how to help the harasser because our focus was on the target
Sure.
and the bystander.
Right.
But that is something that you can think about.
Sure.
That the harasser himself or herself
Mm-hmm.
has a disability in the sense of
Right.
needing to bolster one's ego
Right.
by putting somebody else down.
Exactly. I really think that role is probably will be the most, quote, the toughest nut to crack.
This is Henry McCarthy, serving as a temporary stand-in for Beatrice Wright until we can arrange for her to record the following presentation. It is the highlights of the Diller lecture she gave at the 2003 meeting of the American Psychological Association. This is an annual distinguished presentation sponsored by APA Division 22, Rehabilitation Psychology, in honor of its past president, Leonard Diller, for his contributions to the division and the field. Now let me start her presentation. Slide 1. My Parents and Family. This slide is a 1951 photo I took of my family in our low-cost housing for veterans in San Francisco. Left to right are my 3 children. Colleen, age 6, currently an artist. She is retired as a research psychologist from the Psychiatry Department, University of Florida. Woodring, nicknamed Woody, age 2, currently Distinguished Professor of Cell Biology, University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, Dallas. Eric Olin, nicknamed Ricky, age 4, whose birthday is being celebrated, currently Distinguished Professor of Sociology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. My husband, M. Eric Wright. My parents, Sonia and Jerome Posner. As far as how I got into the field, it happened 91 years ago when I was born to these loving parents, who essentially were humanists deeply concerned with social justice and how to make things better. This provided me with a foundation that would later prove firm in supporting my interest in disability issues. I want to stress another point. Along this photo journey, you will meet 10 psychologists who stand out for seeding ideas that blossomed until I was ready to build upon them in my own work. I studied, did research, and or published with them, inextricably intermingling their ideas with mine. I honor them all in my memory and in this presentation. Slide 2. Solomon Asch, who died in 1996. I entered Brooklyn College as a 16-year-old in 1934. It wasn't long before I gravitated to Solomon Asch's course in social psychology, where I became fascinated with his ideas about social perception and conformity. Soon I became his assistant in conducting experiments on the autokinetic effect, which demonstrated the power of social influence. Asch's minority of one experiments some years later showed the importance of social support in enabling a person to resist social conformity. He was honored in 1967 with the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. Slide 3. Abraham Maslow, who died in 1970. While at Brooklyn College, I took a course with Abraham Maslow in abnormal psychology. He interviewed me at length as part of his study on human motivation, which eventually led to his formulation of 5 levels of needs, starting with physiological needs and ending with the need for self-actualization, thereby providing a model that gives a positive thrust to human nature. During those undergraduate years, I attended a series of lectures by Max Wertheimer, who lived from 1880 to 1943, a founder of Gestalt psychology, where I learned about factors that incline people to perceive things as belonging together, and also about the importance of the context in which a part is embedded. The Gestalt principles of perception became part of my understanding of human behavior in general. Their applications to rehabilitation psychology later became apparent. Austin Wood, a member of the psychology department at Brooklyn College, encouraged me to study with Kurt Levine at the University of Iowa. I applied in 1938 and was fortunate to be accepted. Slide 4. Kurt Levine, who died in 1947. This autographed photo was given to me and my husband, Eric, who also received his Ph.D. with Levine. Those graduate years were momentous indeed, for I met and married my husband during that time, the Depression continued, and Hitler was marching across Europe. Yet in the midst of all that, the stimulation of new ideas and experiences was exhilarating. Levine's famous formula, behavior equals a function of the person in interaction with the environment, and his phenomenological approach to theory building have served as guides in my own work. Some experiments in which I assisted included the Autocracy versus Democracy experiment by Levine, Lippitt, and White, which is an example of a social psychological experiment, and Changing Food Habits, which is an example of action research. My dissertation, titled Fairness and Generosity, an experiment in the development of ideology, 1942, was carried out under the direction of Levine and Tamara Dembo. You can see that my interest in values appeared early in my career. Levine died at the age of 57 after having contributed mightily to the fields of action research and group dynamics within the broader field of social psychology. The Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, Division 9 of APA, honored him by inaugurating the Kurt Levine Memorial Award. I'd like to recount an episode of sex discrimination. In 1940, my husband received his Ph.D. and I my M.A., at which point he accepted an appointment at Ohio State University. Since I needed one more year of residency before I could complete my dissertation elsewhere, we decided that we would commute between the two cities for that year, after which I would join him. I needed the signature of the dean of the graduate school to verify my registration. When I gave him the card, he sternly admonished me, challenging what I was doing at the university when my place as a wife was by the side of my husband during his first teaching job. I remember mumbling something to the effect that we had discussed it. Reluctantly, the dean signed. Would he have admonished my husband if the situation had been reversed? Ironically, some 55 years later, in 1996, that same university recognized me as a distinguished alumna of the University of Iowa. At this celebratory occasion, I did not mention the 1940 incident, but now it is recorded in some detail as a significant event in my own career and as an example of the role of women assumed by society at that time. Slide 5, Levine's Typology Meeting. Levine arranged an annual gathering of behavioral scientists interested in his approach in psychology. It was called the Typology Meeting and usually took place during Christmas vacation. This slide shows those attending the 1940 meeting at Smith College in Massachusetts. Besides Levine and my husband and myself, you can locate Tamara Dembo, Margaret Mead, Kurt Kafka, Ralph White, J.J. Gibson, and other well-known persons. Can you imagine the vitality of ideas that bounced around as a single paper was discussed at length? Slide 6. Carl Rogers, who died in 1987. Having completed my third year of residency in 1941, I moved to Ohio to be with my husband while writing my dissertation. Fortune would have it that Carl Rogers was teaching at Ohio State, and I eagerly joined his class in client-centered therapy. Transcribed audio records of client sessions were reviewed line by line to determine how well the counselor reflected the thoughts and feelings of the client. This approach prepared me well for the time when I would stress the distinction between the insider and outsider perspectives in my work in rehabilitation psychology. Carl Rogers achieved well-deserved acclaim as years went by. Slide 7. Work during World War II. Then came December 7, 1941. In the living room of our Ohio home, my husband and I listened to FDR declare war, and we knew our plans would now be on hold. 6 months later, I received my Ph.D. By then, my husband was in the service. Wolfgang Kohler, who lived from 1887 to 1967, asked Levine to recommend someone to join the faculty at Swarthmore College. Levine promptly offered my name, and promptly I was accepted. This is a good example of how societal circumstances, in this case expanding the prescribed role of women, made it easy for me since most young men were in service or subject to the draft. While at Swarthmore, I attended Kohler's introductory psychology class where I continued to learn about Gestalt views of perception. After 2 years, I moved to California to be with my husband, who was stationed at the Oak Knoll Naval Hospital as a psychologist. Before long, I accepted a position with the United States Employment Service in San Francisco, with the responsibility of assessing and then finding a job for persons with disabilities who were hard to place, an urgent need because of the shortage of workers. This was my introduction to basic disability issues. I remember urging personnel managers to modify the physical conditions or to arrange a buddy from among the employees so that a prospective worker could be hired. Notice that it was societal circumstance that favored this kind of innovation and presaged the value of reasonable accommodations that have since been enacted into law. Slide 8. Roger Barker, who died in 1990. Roger Barker invited me to join him in producing the book Adjustment to Physical Handicap and Illness, a survey of the social psychology of physique and disability, 1946. Barker had also studied with Levine, so it was natural that social psychology framed the discussion, including that of normal physique. For the first time, I believe, the position of persons with a disability was conceptualized as a minority group. In the years that followed, Barker devoted himself to the study of behavior in its natural habitat, a field that became known as ecological psychology, for which he has been highly acclaimed. Division 22 established the Distinguished Contribution Research Award in his name. Slide 9. Tamara Dembo, who died in 1993. This photo captures Tamara Dembo's vibrancy and capacity for appreciation. I joined Tamara and Gloria Latier-Leviton at Stanford University in a study involving more than 100 injured servicemen who were interviewed about their everyday experiences following their first furlough home from the hospital. The qualitative analysis of the interviews led to important new concepts underlying the social-emotional relations involved in, for example, pity, sympathy, curiosity, and help. Recommendations were delineated for both parties involved. The concepts of disability as a value loss, value changes in accepting loss, and the difference in perspectives of the insider and outsider are examples of basic concepts originating in this research that have had a lasting influence in my work. The study bore the title Adjustment to Misfortune, a Problem of Social Psychological Rehabilitation. The term rehabilitation referred to both the person and society. Tamara spearheaded this study. She was rightfully acclaimed as a distinguished psychologist as years went by. In 1961, she served as president of Division 22. In her honor, a symposium on the insider versus outsider perspectives was published in Rehabilitation Psychology, 1975, with Leonard Diller as the editor. Tamara received her Ph.D. under Kurt Levine in Germany. Even though this investigation had been supported by the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development and the Surgeon General's Office, no psychological outlet accepted it. I believe this was probably because its primarily qualitative analysis did not meet the hallmark at that time of scientific research. Once published by Artificial Limbs in 1956, however, it quickly became noticed, not by psychology but by the Rehabilitation Counseling Division of the American Personnel and Guidance Association, that recognized it with an award in 1959. 10 years later, it was reprinted in a journal on blindness research, and finally, in 1975, in Rehabilitation Psychology. Gloria Latier-Leviton, co-author of Adjustment to Misfortune, years later investigated the different perspectives between the insider and outsider on 7 important issues, including hope, preferential treatment, and independence. The resulting publication, Professional and Client Viewpoints on Rehabilitation Issues, appeared in 1973 in Rehabilitation Psychology. Slide 10. The University of Kansas. Looking forward to life in a university town, we arrived in Lawrence, Kansas after the Great Flood of 1951, where the green landscape contrasted sharply with the browning of West Coast summers. This slide shows Fraser Hall, the home of the psychology department on the 4th floor, overlooking the Bell Tower Memorial to World War II and the city below. Because of nepotism restrictions, I could not be a candidate for a faculty position anywhere on campus. During the 12 intervening years before nepotism was rescinded, however, the department supported my efforts to remain involved in psychology. I carried out research with Lois Murphy on resilience in children, worked with parents of young children who were deaf, published my book, Physical Disability, A Psychological Approach, and spent 2 years with the Medical Clinic in Topeka on a postdoctoral Switzer fellowship. I became a fellow of Division 22 in 1955, served as its president in 1962-63, and delivered the presidential address, Spread and Adjustment to Disability, which examined factors in perception that unwittingly extend the severity of disability and included recommendations for guarding against that problem. The Division 22 journal, Rehabilitation Psychology, started as a newsletter in 1953, I being its first editor. My father ran off mimeographed copies for distribution. The first conference in which Division 22 participated was held at Princeton University in 1958, not long after the division was formally established. Its mission was to examine The Role of Psychology and Psychologists in Rehabilitation. As editor of the conference proceedings, I was charged with integrating the great diversity of viewpoints expressed by the 66 participants from 7 types of work settings. A major dilemma arose in reaching consensus concerning the definition of rehabilitation itself. To resolve this problem, I made explicit a dozen principles and assumptions that seemed implicitly to unite the various opinions. They referred to the importance of, for example, assets of the person, variability of treatment, active client participation, and societal responsibility. This set has gradually been expanded in a number of articles until it reached 20 value-laden beliefs and principles that are in my own 1983 book. Slide 11. Rehabilitation Literature, published by the Easterseal Society. Rehabilitation literature, the publication of the National Easterseal Society, is presented here as an expression of my appreciation for its tremendous role in abstracting and publishing psychological articles at a time when other sources for such articles were limited. This particular issue features the article on the hopes of parents of children with disabilities, authored by myself and Franklin Shantz. Regretfully, Rehab Lit ceased publication. I was a member of the Society's Professional Advisory Council from 1973 until 1981. Slide 12. Nancy Kerr, who died in 2001. Nancy Kerr served as past president of Division 22, editor of Rehabilitation Psychology, and member of the Professional Advisory Board of the Easterseal Society. She devoted her career to helping people with disabilities, especially children, in her research, teaching, and community activities. Through dint of conviction and perseverance, she demonstrated a tremendous capacity to cope with adversity in her own life. Following a bout with polio at the age of 22, she used a wheelchair, reared 3 children as a single mother, obtained her Ph.D., and became a professor at Arizona State University. In 1992, a stroke took away speech and language, which she was able largely to regain by practicing rehabilitation exercises designed primarily by herself. Her insights about dealing with aphasia appeared in an article she wrote specifically for speech and language rehabilitation therapists. Lee Meyerson became her collaborator and lifelong partner. Slide 13. Lee Meyerson, who died in 2002. Lee Meyerson, past president of Division 22, helped form its precursor as a special interest group of APA. It was his urging that led the division to begin publishing the journal Rehabilitation Psychology in 1972. He served as its editor for several years. Most of his career was spent on the faculty of Arizona State University, where he combined an understanding of Levinian theory and Skinnerian techniques to improve the abilities of children. A number of films demonstrating this approach are still enlightening. Lee became profoundly deaf as a result of osteomyelitis at the age of 13. Despite his productivity in research and excellence in teaching, he encountered a series of discriminatory actions on the part of the chairman of the department that were so unjust as to prompt Lee to become the first person to seek redress of grievances when the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was enacted. Years later, after his case was settled out of court, his university recognized him as a distinguished Regents Professor in 1988. Together with his wife, Nancy Kerr, the Meyerson Foundation, bearing the names of Lee's parents, was formed. This foundation supports disability projects, a midwinter meeting of rehabilitation psychology, and the Wright Dembo annual lecture. Slide 14. Symbol of access. This symbol, now used all over the world, was selected in 1969 at the 11th World Congress of Rehabilitation International held in Dublin. It is the first international symbol, I believe, to signal the importance of environmental accommodations. As a U.S. representative to the World Commission on Social Aspects of Disability of Rehabilitation International, I took the opportunity to present my ideas concerning the coping and succumbing frameworks in an address at that conference entitled Activism versus Passivism in Coping with Disability. Slide 15, Australian Stamps. To show support of the mission of Rehabilitation International at its 12th World Congress, held in Sydney in 1972, the Australian government issued 3 stamps showing people with disabilities engaged in valued real-life activities. 2 of these are shown here. At this Congress, I stressed the importance of the different perspectives between the insider and outsider in an address entitled Personal Perspective in Mitigating Suffering. Slide 16, Euchre's Conference on Attitudes. I wish I had a better picture of Harold Euchre, for he played such a pivotal role in studies of attitudes once his scale, Attitudes Towards Disabled Persons, was published. Division 22 honored him by establishing a research award in his name. He titled his 1986 conference, where this photo was taken, Attitudes Towards Persons with Disabilities, thereby endorsing the preferred non-disabling language. As early as 1960, I had recommended alternatives to disabling terminology, some of which have been adopted by publications of Division 22 and APA. In 1981, I presented Disabling Metaphors, Causes and Cures as an award address. In this slide, I am addressing the Euchre Conference by examining the fundamental negative bias, which impels the perception of negatives as the cause and effects of disability. Several years earlier, I presented the Distinguished Coulter Lecture at the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine in 1979, where I emphasized the need to adjust the rehabilitation focus to include the situation as well as the person. Once the underlying flaws of perception are understood, corrective measures become obvious. Harold Euchre was born with cerebral palsy. Besides the esteem shown by Division 22, he was honored by Hofstra University, where he served as professor of psychology and provost for many years. In 1999, not long after his death, I received an honorary doctorate from Hofstra University. Tamara Dembo had also been recognized in this way some years before. Slide 17, Fritz Heider, who died in 1988. Fritz Heider's acclaimed book, Interpersonal Relations, was published in 1958. At that time, I was unable to occupy a faculty position at the university, and instead collaborated with Heider in writing this book. Major theories of balance and attribution are elaborated in it. Heider was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1981 and became a distinguished professor at KU. Being impressed with the implications of Heider's work, I prepared a paper for publication in the American Psychologist titled Extension of Heider's Ideas to Rehabilitation Psychology. I urged expediting peer review because of Heider's impending death. Unfortunately, Heider died before the paper was published in 1989. Slide 18, My Study in Lawrence, Kansas. This is a photo of my study where most of my writing since 1971 took place. It was taken in 1984 upon receiving the Higuchi Research Award in Applied Science from the University of Kansas. The picture of my husband Eric adorns my desk to show my love and gratitude for his devotion to our family and support of my work. An active Division 22 member, he also specialized in hypnotherapy, psychotherapy, and human sexuality. Among my colleagues at KU, I would like to acknowledge Frank Shantz, with whom I did research and collaborated in the training program in rehabilitation psychology. He received the Roger Bacher Research Award in 1996. Rick Snyder also deserves recognition for serving as director of the clinical program following my husband's tenure, supporting my work in many ways, and having contributed outstandingly to research and the university. Until his death, he was the M. Eric Wright Distinguished Professor in Clinical Psychology. To conclude this narrative, I would like to tell you about Tenny, the dog in the photo that belonged to my son and his wife, and was given to me upon the death of my husband. He came with me to the university, always unleashed, because he quickly responded to my call, and accompanied me to all meetings and to my graduate class. When the university banished dogs from campus, TENI was exempted. At my last meeting as a member of the University Council in 1985, a resolution was universally passed honoring TENI, quote, for coming to all meetings and immediately going to sleep, thus serving in a manner no less intelligent than any other of its members, end quote. Thank you. Sigmund Freud wrote that the indicators of a healthy, successful life are the ability to work and the ability to love. The perspective and principles advanced by Beatrice Wright affirm that all people are capable of working and loving if given the necessary nurturance, opportunity, and support. May we all come to demonstrate those abilities to work and love in the measure that Beatrice Wright continues to express in her life. Thanks, Beatrice, for your example and inspiration. Peace and love from all of us.